Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk about electrical recording, at least its development, and some of its social implications. Not only social, but also, I should say, industrial, because there was a it was a massive revolution, and it wasn't exactly a very well accepted revolution. Now, the work on the electrical process, the main one for Bell Telephone Labs, was done by Maxfield and Harrison, and they made a number of vertical and horizontal recordings testing their system, which was all based on a system called matched impedance, which was actually what they were working on with telephones, and they worked it toward sound recording. I have shown this before, but I figure I'll start this off with. This is kind of cool. This is one of the test recordings for Bell Telephone Labs. It was done by Victor. Of course, Victor did all the info. It was 1924, and of course, you'll notice it's marked like lateral, and it wasn't a vertical recording. But these were all part of the whole thing. They were trying to figure everything out. It took a long, long time. This was not an easy process to totally figure out, and it took its time. And it's kind of neat to see some of these recordings survive from that. A vast majority, in fact, probably most of them, were destroyed because they served no true purpose, and no one was thinking of the historical implications. Now, electrical recording, there had been experiments going all the way back to like 1920, 21. They made a telephone line recording of the tomb of the unknown soldier, the ceremonies. They tried doing that. There were recordings in Europe where they tried over various telephone lines, and it was problematic at best. And what I want to mention about electrical recording is more the reaction to it rather than the technical ideas behind the development of it. Now, granted, we know we have the Bell telephone system, Western Electric, Columbia 78s will have it. It's because Victor dragged. Victor, of course, would use it, and of course they would use their system of playback, which was the orthophonic Victrola, which Columbia could not use. Nobody else had anything quite like that. Now, let's go back to the time when all of this stuff is going on, all the research on the electrical system of recording. Now let's go first off to the Edison Company. They were very content in doing what they were doing. They had no interest whatsoever in electrical recording. And nothing really happened, actually. Edison was in charge. They had a product that produced recordings that were, in fidelity terms, better than any other company. Yes, granted. But that's acoustically. Things are going to change. When the first electrical recordings come out, Edison says it's hogwash, garbage. Walter Miller, probably kissing Edison's ass a little bit, says that it sounds like music coming out of a rain barrel. That was his description of what the orthophonic Victrola sounded like. And so there was a complete and total denial of electrical recording with Edison. It's interesting to note that what they eventually were doing as time went on, they were working in Walter Miller's basement clandestinely on some electrical recording. And I always found it rather fascinating that some of the first Edison electrical recordings, which will not come out until 1927, were made by using RCA equipment. It's pretty incredible when you think about it. because they didn't have anything. And those first Edison diamond discs that are made, mainly done with RCA equipment, at least amplifying equipment. They had to develop their own cutters and everything else, which Theodore Edison was pretty much in charge of and taking care of. He was working with Walter Miller on developing that. They had loudspeakers set up at the laboratory, which Edison wasn't fond of. But fortunately, as fortune would have it, at this point in Edison's life, he's involved in goldenrod research. So he really doesn't get involved in the fray. He just sits there and says evil things about electrical recording and also radio as well. In fact, Edison's comment about this whole electrical thing, which made no sense to him whatsoever, he said, as soon as this radio craze is over, people will come back to the acoustic phonograph. He couldn't be more wrong, but he didn't know. You got to remember, he's an 80-year-old man. I mean, he had had his time. He was the boy wonder, but by the time he was 80, the world had changed so much because of what he had done. And he just didn't fit in the world that he had created. And so the Edison Company finally got into electrical recording, but very late, and through rather bizarre methods. There's a lot more to this, and you could talk for an hour on some of the stuff that they did, but this is just giving you a general, quick little overview. Now, when it came to the other companies, let's talk about the most powerful, most famous company around at the time, the Victor Talking Machine Company, under the control of Eldridge Reeves Johnson. Now, Eldridge Johnson was getting up there in years. He wasn't that old, but he wasn't too emotionally stable at times. He had breakdowns quite often, and he hated the idea of being an executive. In fact, going all the way back to like 1901, he was ready to sell off all of his interests in the fledgling Consolidated Talking Machine Company. But as fortune would have it, he would take over and run the Victor Talking Machine Company. Now, by the time we get into the 1920s, Eldridge Johnson is not too pleased with something called radio. He hates it. He actually has a kindred spirit in Thomas Edison. And these two gentlemen, now granted, Eldridge Johnson at this point is not that old. 1924 into 25, what is he? He's 58 years old. It's not that old at all. Well, you know, from my perspective. and the thing is that he hates radio, despises radio, hates everything about RCA. Now, eventually, they had to work out an agreement where they could make Victrolas with a space where you could put an RCA radio in them. They eventually worked that deal out. They had the flat tops, which Eldridge Johnson hated too, because he liked the idea of the curved top because you couldn't put anything on top of the Victrola. Well, he was set in his ways, just like Thomas Edison, and he hated anything electrical. And radio got stronger and stronger, and the Victor fortunes started to crash. Sales crashed. And that's when they were approached by Bell Telephone. They blew Bell Telephone off, said, "Get away. We don't want anything to do with this new stuff." Why upset the apple cart? Everything is fine. At least that's the way Eldridge Johnson looked at it. Now, of course, things weren't fine. Financially, the Victor Talking Machine Company, for the first time in its history, was losing lots of money. Things weren't looking good. Sales were down. A lot of the big sellers for Victor were gone. You know, some of the big singers, some of the popular performers were all getting long in the tooth or were dead. Caruso had been dead already for, 3 years by 1924. And they weren't issuing any more Carusos. And you got to think, people like Billy Murray, he was, 47 years old, and Henry Burr was in his 40s as well. These were big sellers. The jazz bands were making records and they were selling, but even still, they sounded like an acoustic recording. It didn't sound like radio. And this was killing Victor. So after initially telling the Bell Telephone Company, Bell Labs, to take a hike, they reconsidered. Unfortunately, during this time, the Columbia Company, which was under ownership of banks at this point, said, we're interested, hello. And they've bought into the Western Electric system, actually ahead of Victor. Now, the Victor people were kind of terrified of what Western Electric was going to do. They gave a demonstration. It was pretty good. They came back later. The Victor engineers got together and created a rudimentary, what you might call, orthophonic machine, which was pretty good, but it wasn't anything like the devices developed by Bell Labs. They wanted to take some of their thunder away, but it was only posturing. Now, it's interesting to know, old employees at the Victor Company were told never, ever, ever mention radio around Eldridge Johnson. It was a very important thing. When I used to talk to the old employees that worked for RCA, who had started with Victor, they used to tell me, they said, we never said a word. You never talked about radio, because it was the worst word you could use to get you fired. Interesting thing, at the Edison Company, the same thing would happen. If you were sitting there and happened to be with Edison when he might be going on one of his firing rages, which he'd go through a factory when he saw profits were down, he would go on firing rages, go walking through buildings and going, what's your name? What do you do? You're fired! I always remember a fun little incident that took place. There was a young fella who had just come to the Edison Company and was actually applying for a job and was ready for his interview. Totally unversed in how to deal with angry Edison when he would come by. I mean, the people in the know would go into the bathrooms right away and hide. Well, this young man was sitting there, and Edison comes charging up into the area. And he went up to him and said, what's your name? And he gave it to him. He said, what do you do? He said, I don't know. He said, I just got here. He said, you're fired. And the guy hadn't even been hired yet. And so after Edison went charging back off in a huff, he went to the fellow he was supposed to see for an interview. He said, oh, don't listen to the old coot. Just come on in. And he was hired. Interesting thing. So you have these two companies that were on the cutting edge, at least at one time. And now they had become somewhat dinosaurs in an age that was changing. And it was changing and leaving them behind. And so this whole electrical system was something they didn't like, they didn't want, and they didn't want to see. And they figured if they didn't talk about it, it wouldn't matter. But it did. So eventually, by 1924, Victor was starting to do experiments on electrical recording. In 1925, electrical recording came out. They had Victor Day in 1925, where they introduced the orthophonic Victrola, which you have to think was an incredible thing. I mean, the sound was, the credenza was an amazing instrument. It was massive. It required that. The odd thing is, the outside horn Victor approximated very much what an orthophonic horn would do, but not quite as well. Because the problem was with the Victor machines, especially the Victor machines, and the Columbias too, and probably Brunswick was different, but the Victor machines had a square horn. Now you have to understand that it's recorded. The recording horns were often round. Sometimes they were shaped like sardine cans, like about this wide. And they had all different size ones. They had long ones, they had wide ones, they had monstrous ones. But the thing is that they were recording a round sound, to make it simple. And they were playing it back through a square horn. Can you see the problem here? You have issues with how the machines produce the sound. The outside horn Victor machines were by far the best player of acoustic records. The next runner-up, oddly enough, was the Eldor. All the machines after that, they came up with all kinds of improvements and bigger horns and whatever. It wasn't going to matter. It was the design of the horn, with the design of the whole system. And so the dinosaurs fought it tooth and nail, but eventually Victor would put out electric records. Eventually Columbia put out electric records. Eventually Brunswick had the Panatrobe system. That was another whole thing that, they came up with the whole electric machine, which had lots of issues because it was really early in this whole system. And lastly, very lastly, Edison did. It's interesting, in talking to the individual who did the electrical work for Edison, in some of it, dealing with recording, Theodore Edison, it's interesting. I wish I could talk to Theodore now. I know so much more now than I did when I talked to him. We're talking about, 30, 30 some odd years ago. I must tell you, I was hooked onto Theodore very kindly by Lee Munsick, who gave me information how to get a hold of him. And of course, I went to programs at the Edison site and talked to people and got to know Ray Wild and all those other folks, and just told them, tell me everything, as much as you can tell me. And in talking to Theodore, it's the same thing. But today, I'm older, I've learned a lot. I just wish I could talk to these people today. I'd have a million questions. But I can only go with what I did at the time. And of course, Theodore was responsible for the development of the Edisonic records, the Edisonic machines. And I have to tell you, unfortunately, there was no money. The company hadn't seen black ink in ages. It was all red. They were losing $1 million a year and more in the recording department. I mean, it was a very sad thing. And they developed the Beethoven and the Schubert orthophonic machines, which are phenomenal machines. They had the longest horn of any Edison machine, and they played very well. But Theodore had a whole network of machines he wanted to make, but they were never made. Of course, he was working on electric machines as well, with a flip cartridge, which he designed to play diamond disc and lateral records. Now, it was a heavy thing, and it wore records pretty badly. But still, it was pretty interesting for its time. And as I mentioned before, Theodore was complaining. They said, they want bass, more, He didn't like that idea. He said it's unnatural. Now, ladies and gentlemen, other things that were very, very important when it came to sound is the public perception of sound. If you think about it, The world itself had grown up with the gramophone, the phonograph, the Victrola, the Graphanola, and they knew what it sounded like. And suddenly radio came in, and those records just didn't sound like music anymore. And this device, radio, which, by the way, Edison could have been involved in, and Victor could have been involved in, but they refused. Developed by RCA, David Sarnoff, totally transformed the world. You couldn't pick your music, which was one of the things that Edison said is going to kill radio. You can't pick the music you listen to. But for the first time, music sounded like music. You heard all those overtones. You heard the sibilants. You heard all kinds of things that you never heard on an acoustic recording. And that electrical system would totally transform the world. And the archaic acoustic system quickly, very quickly, went the way of the dodo. Except for a few cheap labels, like the Harmony label for Columbia, which I believe remained acoustic until 1929, and they sold cheap records. Same thing with Edison until 1927. Victor, excuse me, until 1925. So there's an awful lot about this stuff that we don't talk about much, and I really wanted to share more of this information. You know, I've been studying this stuff for a long time. I don't talk about it too much, except if I do a talk on it and stuff like that. But I figured for the historic record that I should try to leave some information here and share it with people. Oh, by the way, very much like the acoustic and early electrical recording artists, I'm not too technically sharp on new telephones, on cell phones and their recording techniques. I'm using a cell phone. I gotta tell you, I do this in one take. So occasionally there are boo-boos. Occasionally there are mistakes. Occasionally I do things a little wrong. But more or less, I try to do it as well as I possibly can. And so, in honor of the people who made those records years ago, I understand how difficult it can be. And I hope you like this stuff. I hope I can share more stuff with you. And if you do have questions, do have comments, please share them. I love to hear them. I love to learn from other people and also teach other people as well. That's why we're all here, to help each other, to teach each other, and learn from each other. Thank you.